Why did a single tattoo silence the chaos? It was supposed to be just another night behind the bar. Keisha, a young black woman in her late 20s, had grown used to the rhythm of long shifts, wiping counters, taking orders, and forcing a smile through the chaos of rowdy regulars. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. Just a hard-working woman trying to make ends meet in a small southern town where whispers of prejudice often lingered louder than the music on the jukebox. The bar itself had a history. It was the kind of place where rough laughter mixed with cigarette smoke, where outsiders felt the weight of stares the moment they walked through the door. Keisha had learned to navigate it, keeping her head down, never giving people a reason to see her as different. Still, she knew, deep down, that one wrong moment could change everything. That night, as the clock edged toward closing, a sound echoed from outside, the low rumble of engines growing louder, closer, the kind of sound that made the walls vibrate, and the regulars go silent. Keisha glanced toward the door, her heart quickening without knowing why. Something about that sound felt different, like a warning of what was about to come. The doors swung open and the roar of engines outside gave way to the heavy boots of a biker gang stepping inside. The room shifted instantly. The laughter from the regulars died, the jukebox hummed awkwardly in the background, and the air felt heavier than smoke. Keisha's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had seen bikers before, but this group was different. Their eyes didn't just scan the room, they locked onto her. They ordered drinks, loud and crude, slamming money onto the counter with smirks that didn't hide what they were really doing. Testing her. She kept her voice steady, pouring their shots, even as one leaned too close, his breath sour with beer and menace. The others watched her every move, whispering things she couldn't fully hear but didn't need to. She knew what kind of words they were. At first it was small, mocking the way she poured, snapping their fingers for attention, making jokes about her skin. Each insult landed heavier than the last. She tried to brush it off, but the entire bar had gone silent. No one spoke up. No one intervened. It was as if the whole room had decided she was on her own. Then came the moment she dreaded. One of them grabbed her wrist as she reached across the bar. His grip was iron, his grin twisted. Another tugged at the collar of her shirt, yanking just enough to draw laughter from the table. She froze, panic clawing at her chest. This wasn't just harassment. It was humiliation, meant to remind her of her place. And the worst part was the silence. The stillness of every person in that bar who chose not to move, not to help, not to see. Her breath grew shallow. Her mind raced. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but fear pressed her voice down. The gang laughed louder, feeding off her discomfort. One stood tall, towering over her, and with a sudden jerk, the fabric of her shirt tore. The sound of ripping cloth echoed through the room, louder than the jukebox, louder than her pounding heartbeat. In that instant, the humiliation cut deeper than any wound. They didn't just see her as a woman. They saw her as less, as someone they could break for sport. And the bar, filled with familiar faces, stayed frozen, unwilling to stand against them. But then, something unexpected shifted. As the torn fabric slid from her shoulder, the ink beneath her skin was revealed. A tattoo. Bold, sharp, unmistakable, the insignia of an Army Ranger. The laughter stopped, the smirks faded. The same men who just moments ago reveled in her fear now stared, silent, as if they had seen a ghost. What was it about that tattoo that made them pause? Why did a simple mark on her skin carry more weight than her humanity ever did? And what would they do now that their power had been challenged? The bar was silent, every eye locked on the ink etched across Keisha's shoulder. The Army Ranger insignia glared back at the men who had just torn her shirt, their smirks now faltering. For the first time all night, it wasn't Keisha who seemed exposed. It was them. Their laughter choked into uneasy silence. Still, silence didn't mean safety. One of the bikers tried to recover, spitting out a laugh that rang hollow. "What's this? Some kind of joke?" he sneered, but his voice carried less weight now, his bravado cracked. Another stepped closer, his hand hovering at her torn collar as if daring to test her again. The room tensed. Keisha's heart pounded so hard she thought the whole bar could hear it. She stood frozen, fear and fury battling inside her chest. For a split second, no one moved. And then, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers rippled through the regulars who had stayed silent until now. Someone muttered, "That's military." Another added, "She served." The gang looked around, realizing the crowd they thought would stay quiet was no longer just watching in fear. They were watching with recognition, with unease. But the danger wasn't gone. Humiliation burned like fire under Keisha's skin. They had stripped her dignity, mocked her identity, and reduced her to an object for sport. Now they faced the truth they hadn't expected. She was more than they had assumed, stronger than they had wanted to believe. One wrong move from them, one flicker of violence, and this bar could ignite into something far bigger. Keisha stood trembling, but her eyes locked on theirs, no longer pleading, no longer broken. The tattoo had revealed what words could not. And in that fragile, explosive moment, the question hung heavy in the air. Would the bikers back down? Or would they unleash something even worse? The bikers never raised another hand. They backed away slowly, muttering under their breath, their power suddenly stripped not by fists, but by truth. One by one they left the bar, the rumble of their engines fading into the night. Keisha stood behind the counter, her shirt torn, her body trembling, but her spirit unbroken. The room that had once stayed silent now watched her differently. Respect? Guilt? Shame? It was hard to tell. What she knew for certain was this: no tattoo should have been needed to remind people of her worth. That night changed Keisha. Not because she discovered strength she didn't already have, but because it revealed how fragile dignity can be when hatred is allowed to go unchecked. The same neighbors who had known her for years only seemed to see her humanity once they recognized her service. And that truth stung deeper than the humiliation itself. This wasn't just a story about a bar, a gang, or a tattoo. It was a reflection of a painful reality. In a world still scarred by racism, too often people of color must carry proof, titles, or achievements to be seen as equal. Their humanity alone is never considered enough. Keisha walked out of that bar, that night with her head high, but the memory never left her. It wasn't just her battle. It was a reminder of the silent complicity that gives hate its power. So the question remains, how many more Keishas will have to endure humiliation before silence finally breaks? And when the next moment comes, will we watch quietly from the sidelines, or will we stand up and speak out? Her laughter had once been the light of the home, but that night it was silenced by humiliation. A black woman, full of dignity and strength, stood surrounded by people who were supposed to love her husband and his sister. Instead of protection, they chose betrayal. They mocked her skin, her heritage, her very existence, thinking she would shrink, thinking she would stay silent. But they had no idea. The very woman they tried to break was about to rise in a way they never imagined. And what she did next would not only destroy their cruelty, it would leave the world stunned. How did a broken moment turn into a story of unimaginable revenge? Her name was Naomi. She had grown up in a small town where hard work was her second nature, and kindness was the only language she spoke. She met Daniel, a man who seemed at first to admire her fire, her determination, and the way she carried her culture with pride. For years, she poured herself into their marriage, cooking, supporting, building dreams with him. but cracks began to show, not from strangers, but from those closest to her. Daniel's sister, Claire, had always whispered comments behind her back, rolling eyes at Naomi's natural hair, mocking her accent when family gathered. Daniel, instead of standing beside his wife, often laughed along, pretending it was all in jest. Naomi swallowed the pain, convincing herself love was worth the cost. Until one night, the mask slipped completely. It started at a family dinner. Naomi had cooked tirelessly, setting the table with love. But instead of gratitude, Claire smirked as she criticized every dish, mocking its African roots as strange and unfit for civilized taste. Daniel didn't defend his wife. He joined in, ridiculing her food, her culture, even her appearance, while relatives chuckled. Naomi sat frozen, each word cutting deep into her heart. It wasn't just teasing, it was an attack, an unveiling of what they truly thought of her. Later, whispers reached her ears. Daniel and Claire schemed together, plotting to make her feel small, powerless, replaceable. What they didn't know was Naomi's silence was not weakness. It was a storm gathering strength. The humiliation turned into fire inside her. She began to notice more. Bank accounts she hadn't checked in years showed strange withdrawals. Land her family had entrusted to her had been secretly signed away with Daniel's name attached. Claire's fingerprints were on the betrayal, too. They weren't just mocking her. They were stealing her future, dismantling everything she had built. Naomi kept her face calm, but inside every shred of trust was gone. One evening, Daniel mocked her openly again, calling her just a charity case he had saved. Claire laughed so loud it echoed in Naomi's chest. The room spun. She knew she couldn't cry in front of them. She excused herself quietly. That night, she didn't sleep. She planned. Weeks later, Naomi's storm erupted. With evidence of financial fraud in her hands gathered carefully while Daniel underestimated her, she filed papers. Bank authorities froze accounts. Lawyers built cases. The home Daniel mocked her in was stripped from him, because Naomi had always been the legal owner. The business Claire bragged about investing in, Naomi exposed how much of it was funded through stolen assets. Courtrooms replaced dinner tables, and humiliation shifted sides. Daniel's smirk faded when he realized the woman he tried to crush now stood as his judge, jury, and executioner. Claire's laughter died in the echo of the gavel. The betrayal that was meant to destroy Naomi became the rope that dragged them down. Naomi didn't walk away with bitterness. She walked away free. Free from a marriage that had been poison, free from family that had only been chains. The world around her whispered in shock. How could a woman who was mocked for her skin, her culture, her very existence, rise and dismantle the very people who tried to erase her? But Naomi's story wasn't just revenge. It was proof. Proof that silence is not always surrender. Proof that dignity, when tested, can become a weapon. And proof that the ones society often tries to humiliate are the very ones destined to rewrite the ending. So the question remains, how many Naomis will the world try to silence before it learns that every act of cruelty plants the seed of unimaginable strength? She was dressed in elegance, confident, accomplished, ready for a flight that would take her to the biggest meeting of her career. But as she stepped into the first-class cabin, a voice cut through the air. Cold, dismissive. You must be in the wrong place. A white woman blocked her seat, glaring with the kind of entitlement that silences a room. The attendants hesitated. Passengers looked away. And for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. But what none of them knew was that in just 20 minutes, this same arrogance would bring the entire flight to a standstill. Her name was Dr. Maya Brooks, a self-made CEO known for building one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. She had spent years fighting stereotypes, breaking barriers, and proving that success didn't have a color. This flight was supposed to be routine, A short journey to a business summit where she'd be delivering the keynote speech, an honor she had earned through grit and brilliance. She boarded the plane with a quiet confidence, carrying only her laptop bag and a calm smile. For Maya, first class wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Long hours, endless travel, and back-to-back commitments left her little choice but to pay for comfort. But while the world celebrated her accomplishments on magazine covers and business panels, everyday life reminded her of an uglier truth, that no matter how high she climbed, some people would always try to push her back down. When she reached her assigned seat, she was met not with the polite nods of fellow passengers, but with a sharp, unwelcoming stare. A white woman was already seated there, legs stretched, drink in hand, radiating the kind of confidence that came not from achievement but from assumption. She looked at Maya as if she were invisible, or worse, unwelcome. This wasn't the first time Maya had been questioned, doubted, or dismissed. But on this flight, the challenge wouldn't just test her patience, it would reveal something much bigger about power, privilege, and the silent systems that hold it all together. The woman didn't move. Instead, she tightened her grip on the armrest, as though the seat was hers by birthright. "This is my seat," she said flatly, without looking at the boarding pass in her hand. Maya, calm but firm, replied that the seat was indeed assigned to her, 2A. She held out her ticket, but the woman waved it away. The flight attendant arrived, but instead of immediately resolving the situation, she hesitated. She looked at the white woman, then at Maya, then back again, uncertain, almost afraid of confrontation. "Ma'am, perhaps there's been a mistake," the attendant said, directing her words not to the woman squatting in the seat, but to Maya. A familiar knot formed in Maya's stomach. She had seen this before. Polite doubt, wrapped in the guise of procedure. She repeated herself, steady and unwavering. "This is my seat, 2A. The attendant took both boarding passes." Maya's was clear, 2A. The other woman's was for 3C. Yet, even with the truth in her hands, the attendant faltered. "Perhaps you could take another seat, just for now," she whispered, as though asking Maya to make herself smaller for the comfort of others. Eyes turned. Passengers shifted in their seats, watching but saying nothing. Some shook their heads, but none spoke. The silence weighed heavier than the confrontation itself. It wasn't just about a chair on a plane. It was about whether Maya's presence, her success, her very belonging, was valid. Minutes ticked by. The white woman refused to move. The attendant offered her apologies, not to Maya, but to the woman occupying her seat. Maya stood still, refusing to accept the quiet injustice. She had fought too hard, too long to be erased in silence. The tension thickened. A second attendant was called. Then the captain. Whispers spread through the cabin. First-class passengers murmured, annoyed at the delay, but no one confronted the obvious injustice. All it would have taken was one voice, one acknowledgement to say, "She belongs here." But instead, the burden fell on Maya, to hold her ground in the face of disbelief, to resist the pressure to yield, to remind the world that her success was not a mistake. The captain finally arrived, firm and authoritative. He listened briefly, glanced at the tickets, and without hesitation, addressed the white woman. "Ma'am, you are not in the correct seat. You need to move. Now." But instead of standing, she erupted. "This is outrageous. I will not sit behind her. I paid good money for this seat, and I will not be treated this way." Her voice rose, filling the cabin, sharp with entitlement and venom. Gasps rippled through the rows. The captain stood unmoved, his tone cold. "Either you take your assigned seat, or you will be removed from this flight." Her face twisted with fury. She refused again, crossing her arms defiantly. The attendants shifted, passengers craned their necks, and the hum of tension turned electric. For a moment, it seemed like chaos might break loose. Then came the announcement. Unmistakable, final. This flight will not depart until the situation is resolved. The engines quieted. The crew stood waiting. Time stretched, and the reality set in. One woman's refusal to accept equality had grounded an entire plane. For Maya, the moment was surreal. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had simply stood firm in the truth that she belonged where she was. And now, the world was forced to watch the cost of arrogance laid bare for all to see. Eventually, security was called. The woman, still shouting about her rights, was escorted off the plane. The cabin was silent, heavy with the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. Only after she was gone did the flight attendants turn back to Maya, their smiles forced. Their apologies hollow. She finally sat in her rightful seat, but the victory was bittersweet. Because this wasn't just about one chair, one flight, one confrontation. It was about the countless times people like her were asked to move, to shrink, to accept less than what they deserved. The plane took off 20 minutes late, but the delay was nothing compared to the years of prejudice that moments like this represented. Passengers avoided her gaze, unwilling to confront their own silence. And Maya, though she carried herself with grace, felt the weight of knowing that even at the height of her success, she was still seen as less than by some. But she also knew this. She hadn't moved, she hadn't yielded, and in her quiet defiance, she had forced a reckoning. An entire plane had been stopped, not because she asked for more, but because she insisted on what was rightfully hers. This story isn't just Maya's. It's the story of millions whose voices are silenced, whose belonging is questioned, whose presence is challenged in spaces they've rightfully earned. So the question remains, how many more flights must be grounded, how many more moments disrupted, before we finally accept a truth that should never have been questioned, that dignity has no color and respect has no boundaries?